Hey guys, Omni here. Since HBO Max launched this week, I thought it'd be fun to give you guys my top 10 favorite TV shows of all time. Considering right now HBO Max is home to 3 of my top 10 picks, and will be home to a 4th once its current licensing agreement expires with the streaming service that is hosting it right now. So I thought it'd be fun to give you guys my thoughts, my picks, and again, this is just my favorite shows, not saying that these are some of the best shows out there or that some of these are better than the other, just which ones I personally enjoy over the rest. So that's going to be what we're basing this on, and let's go ahead and dive right in. Coming in at number 10 is going to be That 70s Show. I relate to this show so hard, especially Eric Foreman, who, if you combined him with Chandler Bing in Friends, man, do I have a perfect spirit animal when it comes to a TV sitcom character. But his obsession with Star Wars, to his obsession with just models, with collections, with his friends, that tight-knit group that they have, and the varying personalities in this show, it just really resonated with me, and I thought it was hilarious. It never fails to make me laugh. I love these characters. Kurtwood Smith as Red Foreman is just one of the most hilarious father figures in television history, in my opinion. I love this show a lot. A lot of its stoner-ish humor was lost on me in my early years because I was never something I was into or aware of. So a lot of those jokes kind of went over my head until I, became more familiar and aware of how things work in the world. I mean, just to be honest, I didn't even drink, alcohol at all until I was 28. So that gives you the level of innocence that my pure mind had up until that point. But I really love these characters. They stick with me, and it's still one of those shows that I could just put on in the background and listen to for hours. I love these characters, and yeah, that's it. That's my number 10. Coming in at number 9 for me is going to be Game of Thrones, and I think there's going to be 2 groups of people here. One group that's surprised that it even made the list, and one group that might be surprised that it's this low on the list, just barely beating out That 70s Show for me. And I think the only reason for me that it beats That 70s Show is because there's so many memories that I have associated with this show that I just love. It was an event. Game of Thrones was this phenomenon, this cultural event that happened in the world that got people speculating, coming together, and trying to figure out what's going on with this. This was a fantasy show taken so seriously and done so well for the most part, and it really got a lot of people going on. And I was even resistant to it going in because of all the hype and everything surrounding it. And I finally caved once it was into its 4th season and started watching it myself since my friends were already kind of into it. And then from there, it became this thing where we would get together every Sunday, we would hang out, we would watch the episodes, and we would just sit around and speculate after each one about where's this going to go, what's going to happen. And then, of course, yes, there's the big thing of them just dropping the ball, shortening the seasons unnecessarily, not fulfilling a lot of the journeys and character developments that's been set up over these years, and it does hurt the show. And that is why, for me, because of all those memories that I have associated with it, and with how top-notch the first 5 seasons of the show were, I can't forget that, and I won't slate it for that. So for me, it still makes the list because of that, but because it kind of dropped the ball with its quality and its attention to detail, and for everything that happened in the last 2 seasons, it's just lower on the list. Moving on to my number 8 is a show that I think truly took the success and the lessons learned from Smallville and used that as a platform to catapult itself into success, really revolutionizing the comic book genre on television. And of course, that is Arrow, which its stellar first season spun off into various other incarnations, creating the Arrowverse itself, its own cinematic universe on the small screen with The Flash, Supergirl, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Black Lightning, Batwoman, and more to come down the line. It really blew up, where the MCU was really kind of owning the cinematic universe territory on the big screen. DC had a safe, beautiful little comic book embracing home on the small screen with what they were doing there. Now, not that it was the most comic accurate thing, and I know that rubs a lot of purists the wrong way, but I love all of the iterations of these characters that they have on these shows. And Oliver Queen, played by Stephen Amell, became easily one of my favorites and was the backbone of all of these shows there throughout, just earning that namesake of the Arrowverse for these dynamic shows. And even now today, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, which was this huge, massive crossover event, now, due to the budgets and all that stuff, it wasn't some Infinity War Endgame, though it was very much that kind of thing, but on a smaller scale. but it did some things that were unprecedented. It didn't just connect all these different shows together. It ended up connecting a multiverse of shows together, films together. It reached out beyond themselves, connecting it not just to the individual Arrowverse shows, but to the Adam West Batman series, the Christopher Reeve Superman, the 89 Batman flicks. It really grew and expanded even into the DCEU with Ezra Miller appearing. It made it clear and abundant that one of the key things from the DC Comics, of course, is always the various iterations of all of our favorite characters do all exist at the same time thanks to the glory of the multiverse, and it embraced that and landed it. Always nailing it for the most part with its annual crossover events between each of the shows, nailing some very dynamic storylines, nailing some heart with characters between all of them, all branching out from what started back on Arrow. And though the show itself had some rocky seasons, it always had some of the best peaks, I think, that made up for most of those. And unlike with Game of Thrones, it nailed its final season, which arguably for me might even be the best season of the entirety of the show. And I love it. I love it to death. Stephen Amell is just forever a man crush for me, and his absence is felt in the Arrowverse from just going forward since the end of the show. And, you know, it just has me looking and eyeing for where his career might go from there. But I love it. Love what it started. I still follow each one of these shows to this day. And like I said, his absence is felt, but his legacy lives on with that inspiration that lives in these shows, with the success that started off with just this guy on an island with a bow. I love it. I love it to death. And it's just something I'll always come back to and just cherish it deeply. Moving on to my number 7 is going to be my gateway and entry into anime, and I think that's the same case for a lot of people my age, was Dragon Ball Z. And when that first aired on Toonami when I was a kid, it instantly got me hooked. From the animation, the fantasy world that they built out, and the iconic characters, as well as the adrenaline-filled, testosterone-filled fight scenes that went on for days. It just really pulled me in as a young boy, and I just could not stop. I was obsessed with the action, obsessed with the characters, obsessed with what was going to come next. Every time you hear that next time on Dragon Ball Z, and you're just like, no! I can't stand it, man. You just want that next episode. You want it now. I need to know what happened to Goku and the gang. I loved it, man. It just opened the door to so much, a whole other world of animation, a whole other world of cultural ideologies, and it just kept going from there, spanning into a lot of different things, not just on Toonami, but things that I picked up and found on my own. But it all began with those moments and those memories, even going back to see the prequel anime, the one that actually started it all, Dragon Ball. I fell in love with that, watched Dragon Ball GT. I've watched, and I'm completely caught up on Dragon Ball Super. It's just this legacy that has just stuck with me. Those characters are still with me, and some of the best fighting games that I've played in a long time too. And I just love it. I adore the characters, and I thought it was really interesting, especially because it was really, I think it was like for people my age, it was very much a cultural phenomenon of the times. It really resonated and exploded and was this thing that a lot of people gravitated to. I made a lot of my long-standing friendships because we all really loved Dragon Ball Z. So that's me. That's my number 7. My number 6 is a show that's been with me even longer than Dragon Ball Z. It's Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And if you can't tell, I still really like it. I mean, I've got my Green Ranger helmet, the dragon dagger right there, that little statuette. Can't quite see it, but behind my TARDIS is the White Ranger sword Saba. And then I've got the Morphers right here, as well as the original Japanese version of the show and the DVDs for seasons 1 through 3. I loved it. It came out at the right time for me. I was already into Godzilla, so the moment I saw the giant robots fighting giant monsters, I was already in, and then the brightly colored spandex superheroes doing martial arts just really sucked me in. You know, at the time, I enjoyed the banter between the human characters and what's going on, but when you age and you grow up, it's just so much more fun to rewatch it and just be like, what are these people even talking about? The show's dumb, it doesn't make sense, but there's a lot of heart, there's a lot of care that goes into it, and it's just a lot of dumb action fun, and I love it. And it's just left an impression with me. It was the thing that got me into martial arts. It's the thing that got me into starting karate and jujitsu, and really got me into Mortal Kombat, and then just carried on into my love for anime, Dragon Ball Z, and everything that really came from it. Really, superheroes, I think, can all arc back to starting with Power Rangers for me. and I adore it. I can still rewatch it any day of the week. I've done rewatches as early as last year, going back through seasons 1 through 3 since it was on Netflix at the time. I'm not sure if it still is, but I love it. I adore it. It's cheesy, it's dumb, and it just will always have a sweet welcome spot in my heart. We're finally halfway there with my number 5 pick, and that's going to be Avatar: The Last Airbender. I've actually been in the middle of a rewatch of this here recently since it was just added to Netflix not too long ago, and I'm about halfway through the second season, and I'm just falling in love with this show all over again. Not that I ever really fell out of love with it. I think Nickelodeon took the right direction with this show to do something Eastern inspired and really lean into some of those anime elements that show up and appear here in the show, since it came out in the peak, in the height of like stuff with Dragon Ball Z, Toonami and stuff like that, really coming to a rise and getting more and more popular in the West. And I think that one of the things that I really appreciate the show is them using South Korean animation studios to really bring this to life, because it really gives it that anime feel to it as well as giving it that Eastern touch. And I think that's what I love about the show the most, is that even though it was like very much geared towards kids, it never really treated them like children. It took a lot of serious issues, serious ideas, serious philosophies, and helped broaden a lot of people's horizons. You know, exposing people to different ideas, different Eastern philosophies, different ways of thinking, handling a lot of serious issues with like xenophobia, you know, your place in the world, racism, segregation, like, you know, depression. There's so many issues that are really serious in the world that this show tackles to the forefront and doesn't really hold back just because it's in a kid's show. And it's one of those things I really appreciated for it, you know, with that attention to detail that is handled in there as well. And some of the most beautiful animation that I've seen from anything released in the West from a Western studio. Like I said, even though it was animated primarily by South Korean studios, this was technically a Western show. But the fact that they took these ideas, that they deepened this level of production on a show like on Nickelodeon and like treated children like they were adults, I love that. And the action, the animation never suffered, and it was funny. There was some times where it was definitely very lighthearted. It wasn't super serious all the time. But when it does, it really gets down to business and it hits some really deep nails on the head. And it's just some of the most beautiful animation that I've seen, especially out of Nickelodeon. And it's just, it still stands the test of time. Anytime you hear somebody talk about it, it is nothing but praise. And, you know, this attention to detail, the action scenes, some of the best fights in animation history, I think, are brought to life in this, as well as the beautiful animation that comes out of some of these choreographies, as because they are inspired after real world martial arts. It's another, I just really love the Eastern influences in this and doesn't really shy away from it. And it definitely like is made to butt heads with a lot of the Western ideologies as well. And it really makes people think about what they're doing, the side of the fence that they're on, their approach to certain ideas. And I really love this show for it. And it's beautiful. I love it to death. It gets me emotional. There's so much heart and passion and love that goes into this show. And it's something that I will always recommend to somebody, especially when I find out that they haven't seen it. It's also one of the most frustrating things to talk about when you're like, have you seen Avatar? Because a lot of people, if they haven't seen Avatar: The Last Airbender, they always think you're talking about Avatar with the blue aliens. And I'm sorry, unless somebody's talking about James Cameron and what he plans to do with his 800 Avatar sequels, no one's going to mention the Avatar movie from years ago. That's rarely what anybody's going to be talking about, because honestly, that's one of the most, and no matter how much money it made, that is the only thing I remember from it, is how much money in the box office it actually made. So, sorry, this turned into like a slight getting thrown at that, but it's just like one of those things when you deal with it every time, you're like, oh, you got to check out Avatar, and you just get that response. It's like, the aliens with James Cameron? No, you fool. Anyway, that's my number 5. My number 4 pick is going to be Breaking Bad, and this is another one of those cases where it was just endlessly being recommended that I watch it, and the hype and the buzz surrounding the show just kept growing and growing, but I just kept putting it off. And it wasn't really until it was hitting its 3rd season and the first 2 seasons finally got released onto Netflix that I finally decided to check it out. And it's because there was nothing else on. I was like, yeah, everybody keeps talking about this. It's on here. Let's check it out and see what the big fuss is about. And I just instantly got swept away in it. And this is one of the first times that I can recall really becoming hyper aware of all the things that come together to create a show or film or anything like that, like the writing, the pacing, the direction, the cinematography, the way they set up so many interesting angles, points of view, perspectives in this show. The cinematography is one of the highlights of this show, and I highly recommend it. The other is the performances. Bryan Cranston and Aaron Paul carry this show, but they are by far not the only people doing just a boatload of work with their performances in this. The entire supporting cast of this show is just as up to par. I think from beginning to end, this is one of the rare occasions where this show is borderline flawless. It is perfect and as close as you can get for perfection when it comes out of a TV series. It nails it. And from a show that starts off with a premise where you kind of have an idea of where it's going to end, they keep the entire path there swerving. They keep the twists. You never really know what's going to happen, and it still manages to do the impossible and stick the landing. This show was just a phenomenon in film and television history, and it still to this day is something I love to go back and revisit. I love the spinoff Better Call Saul. El Camino was even a great masterclass in like returning to this world, even though there's some inconsistencies and continuity problems, given it was made years after the show ended. It still kept that feeling, that tone, and it just built out this world. Vince Gilligan, he's just like choice for when it comes to crafting these shows. I think that he did something amazing with this, and he has some involvement that led to this that coming up in another show we'll be getting to here in a little bit. But he's got some history, and he comes from some humble beginnings, and I love it, man. We'll be talking about that here in a minute, but I love Breaking Bad. If you haven't watched it, you need to check it out. Coming into my number 3 pick is Doctor Who, and this is a show that I picked up about 6 or 7 years ago, and I tried to watch it twice. There was 2 different times I started this, and I really started to dive into it because I've always heard about the pop culture relevance of the show. I had a lot of friends that were kind of into it as well, and I finally was like, you know what? I'll see what this is all about. And I decided to dive into it, and that first time I tried to dive in, I just couldn't get past the production value of it at all. It was so hard to take it seriously, and I watched the first episode of the revival, and then that was it for a while. I tuned back in later for a second time. I was like, all right, listen, I'm going to push through. People keep talking about this show. They say it's just great. It's awesome. I'm going to push in and see how I can find what everybody's talking about in this. And I gave it a second shot. I was like, I'm not going to tap out, even if I think it's silly, if I think it's goofy, if I don't think it's very well produced or the budget's just too low for it. And I hammered through. And it was about episode 6 or 7, I think. I can't remember off the top of my head. It was the first episode where we see a Dalek for the first time. And that was the moment that sucked me into this show. And from there on, I was on board 100%. Even if it got goofy, even if it got silly, I was on board. Because now I understood kind of the feeling, the show, the tone of the show, the direction of the show. And it just absorbed me from that point onward. The character of the Doctor became easily one of my favorite fictional characters of all time. The hopefulness of the Doctor, the depth of the Doctor, the despair that is there. There's so many layers of this character and they don't even carry a weapon. That's one of the things I appreciate about this hero so much, is that all the adventures they go on, all the things they do, all the battles and people they fight for is all done with nothing but a futuristic screwdriver. And, there's some great quotes from a lot of the showrunners that have talked about that being the main draw. This is a person that just travels. They're there to observe. They're there to try and inspire. They're there to, be a beacon of hope and not a beacon of violence, of segregation, of opposition. And I love it. There's a lot of great themes in the show. There's a lot of great ideas, explorations. There's some amazing sci-fi, emotion, heart. This show's got a little bit of everything for everybody, I think. It's not for everybody, I'm sure. There's a lot, but I think you can find an episode that would be something that anybody could gravitate to. This is a show that stood the test of time. It started way years before this revival. I even signed up for BritBox like 2-3 years ago, and it was my mission to watch all of it. I was up to date with the revival series, and I was like, you know what? We're between seasons. I need my fix. I went back, I watched every episode, at least the surviving episodes of all of classic Doctor Who as well. I just fell in love with it. It swept me away. The lore, the history, the legacy, it's just dumbfounding and it's awe-inspiring. And that's what the Doctor is to me. It's an awe-inspiring character of hope, of intelligence, of compassion, and of acceptance. And this is something I think the world really needs. And it's something that's always been prevalent with the Doctor all the way to the beginning. Even when he's a little bit of a dick, even when he's a little bit abrasive, at the end of the day, it was always about hope, about the greater good, and about, doing the right thing over anything else. And that's something I really admire about it. It's some amazing sci-fi. There's some great stories in here. There's a lot of fun, a lot of heart, a lot of action, a lot of terrifying moments. The show goes up and down and all over the place, and it's fantastic. I love it to death. It's another show I definitely recommend it, though I understand this being one of those kind of shows where it's not going to be for everybody for sure. But it's awesome. It's a show that I'm glad that I stuck it out and got through some of those more cheesy moments in the beginning. And I've grown to appreciate a lot of those cheesy moments, especially after where it's grown and where it came from. And it's just like maybe it was a lot of my preconceived notions, what I was used to at the time, and, getting over that and subverting myself and being able to accept a different point of view, see things from a different angle. And that's something that is presented at all times with the Doctor and still is part of the DNA of the show today. I watch it. I'm still current with it. They've changed showrunners here recently, so it's still kind of trying to regain its ground again. But I feel like this last season, it's finally picking back up in the right direction once again. But I love this show to death. I got my TARDIS here, a couple screwdrivers. This has been it became something that I just was on the sidelines of, and now it's just like part of me now. I love this show. I love all of the characters, the companion characters, the guest characters, everything in this show. I love it. And it's got a lot of hints and a lot of DNA and inspiration that comes from one of my favorite shows of all time, which we will get to in a moment. We're down to my number 2, and that is Friends. And I know a lot of people probably just cringed and winced in pain at hearing that compared to some of the other things on this list, but it has such a soft spot in my heart that it was the primary thing that I was waiting for HBO Max to come out for, is so I could finally stream the show again. I mean, I have it all on Blu-ray. Got my little Central Perk coffee mug right there as well. But I love the show. I'm lazy. I'd much rather stream it than switch discs. I know, first world problems and all. But I love it. I love this show to death. I was a kid of the 90s. I was born in the late 80s. I grew up all through the 90s, so a lot of this stuff resonated me. When I was younger, when the show actually aired in 93, I'm pretty sure it was 93, somewhere 93 to 96, something like that. I thought it was funny enough. I didn't really understand all the adult jokes and all that stuff, and I just thought the humor, the laugh tracks, everything like that drew me in. As I aged along with the show, eventually it got to the point where I was caught up and I was watching the show as the final season was airing, and I just love it to death. And it's one of those things that, especially as somebody who grew up through the 90s, it's a time capsule of that time. And it's the humor, the ideologies, the frames of mind, even though a lot of it is dated from now, from a perspective of 2020, obviously, it's a little dated in some ways, but it always had the best of intentions, and it did pave the way for a lot of progressive things at the time. Even if you look at it from a lens today, it might seem a little abrasive, but it definitely was never the intention. And definitely during its time, it was paving the way for a lot of great things in television. It was hilarious even. And it always had the heart there. It was just, the characters are iconic as can be. Chandler Bing is just a character I will always relate to, with his humorous defense mechanisms, his sarcasm, and I mean, that pretty much defines him as a character. These characters aren't like relatable by any sense because they're kind of exaggerations of various traits, but that's what makes them funny. They were very much endearing to me. Their storylines, their blights, their struggles, their convictions, the lessons that they have to learn throughout the show.
help with a lot of things going on. And I think it led us to the point that we are today in a lot of these ways with a lot of different sitcoms and stuff like that. They fought and paved the way for a lot of modern television, especially in the sitcom and comedy front. And it's something that it was monumental in its time. It has some iconic lines, iconic moments, one of the most iconic relationships on TV, whether it's toxic or not. Of course, Ross and Rachel. The show was, it was just fantastic. And I still enjoy it to this day. I still find it extremely hilarious. I love these characters. I will always be there to support, love, and adore and appreciate every moment along the journey with them. I am a little apprehensive about them all coming back years later after having been apart from working with each other for this reunion special that's coming that's supposedly unscripted. I'm kind of concerned about that because, yeah, a lot of the show was unscripted beats whenever they would come in. There was so much ad-libbing that would go on because the characters had such a deep connection with each other. They spent so much time around each other. Their chemistry together was very well honed because of all that time they spent together. I'm concerned about that not being there and this being an unscripted special and them having lost some of that. I know they get together frequently and still keep in touch, but like, that's not exactly the same thing. So I'm curious to see how that's going to all pan out. But this show lives on. I love it to death, and I still crack up every time. Can I be more excited? I can't. All right, guys, we finally made it to the end of my list for my number one TV show of all time, and that is The X-Files. This show was unlike any other, and I love it more than any show I've ever seen. You know, its influences can still be felt to this day, whether you're aware of it or not. You know, there's 3 shows on this list alone that either directly or indirectly owe their DNA to The X-Files. This show initially came out in 1993, and it was kind of set up to fail, but it blew up. It became a cultural phenomenon at the time, and there was no other show on TV quite like it. Since then, there's been plenty of shows that's tried to copy that format. A lot of the CW shows that exist today owe a lot of their format and storytelling to The X-Files, since the first 5 seasons of that show were filmed in the same area by a lot of the same people and production teams that are still working to this day. You know, the X-Files is what started the entire monster or villain of the week thing with their standalone episodes. You know, the show follows 2 special agents of the FBI, Mulder, played by David Duchovny, and Scully, played by Gillian Anderson, who work on these unsolved cases called the X-Files, which have no scientific or conventional concrete evidence or methods of understanding. And it's their job to try to do their best to investigate these, which leads them down a path down the paranormal, spiritual, and even into a vast alien conspiracy with the government. And that's not all it is. There's monsters, there's science fiction in here. This goes down every element of genre that you can go down to. It's funny, it's hilarious, it's scary, it's thrilling. This show rides all the lines of every genre you can think of while following these investigators. And it is fantastic and creative. And any show comes since then, Buffy, Smallville, like I said, pretty much everything on the CW, everything filmed in Vancouver owes so much of its existence and DNA to what the X-Files brought to that industry. You know, Arrow, that same format, all comes and extends back to this show. Breaking Bad, Vince Gilligan got his started with producing, writing, directing, and all of that on 40-some plus episodes of the X-Files, and then started off, and he does credit that show and his experience there for a lot of his success with Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. You know, Doctor Who even traces a lot of its lineage back for its modern revival to the X-Files. There's a lot of formats and DNA that carries over into those shows, and it carries on today. Not to mention, it's got one of the most iconic TV themes of all time. And it always grinds my gears when the only way it gets recognized today is as the Illuminati theme from that stupid internet meme. No, you fools, it's from X-Files. Some of the first appearances of a lot of people who are breakout stars today. Ryan Reynolds appears, Jack Black's in the show, Giovanni Ribisi, Bryan Cranston, Aaron Paul. There's so many people that rode the line in this show, not to mention our 2 leads, some of the most iconic characters in television history, Mulder and Scully and their dynamic, their platonic respect relationship, where everything on TV during the 90s was about sex and that appeal, that love, and that draw, they did not ride that home. Their dynamic was this push and pull of mutual respect, platonic friendship, and it rode throughout the season, and so much so that there was so much tension between the two of them that everybody in the X-Files fandom were trying to vie for them to hook up, and they started the term shippers. You know, it wasn't the first ship by any means of the imagination. That was, of course, going as far back as to Star Trek and stuff with Spock and Kirk. But they started that term and that movement and that move forward. It was one of the first forums on the internet devoted to a fandom was for X-Files. And that carries on today. There's a lot of those influences. Some of the creature concepts still live on today. Some of the episodes, even though it owes some of its roots back to things as early as, you know, the Twilight Zone, the X-Files did so much that was revolutionary on TV and storytelling with these Monster of the Week, these standalone self-contained episodes with a serialized story thread that carried throughout the arcs, and that's something that's just been mimicked repeatedly to this day, and with one of the most iconic villains of all time, the cigarette-smoking man. It spawned 11 seasons from 1993 all the way out to 2018 and 2 theatrical films. Though the second film wasn't well received because I think they waited too long to actually do that one, the first film was unprecedented. It took place between 2 seasons. If you wrapped up season 5, did not watch the film, and started season 6, you would be a little lost because it bridged it. They did this entire thing where they was like, all right, you want to know what happens between now and the next season of X-Files? You better go to the theater. And people did. And it was well received. It was a fantastic made film too. Like I said, the second film, not so much. It came up about 8 years after the series finale, the initial series finale. And they didn't really play into like what a lot of the fandom wanted. So it was a little bit of a disappointment, but it was still fantastic seeing the characters back on screen again. And it's just lovely. I mean, you still see a lot of these people popping up here and there throughout the years. And it's just fantastic. I always attribute it, and a lot of my friends, a lot of my family and stuff like that. Anytime I'm watching something with somebody, I might recognize somebody. I'm like, that guy was on this episode of X-Files. I was like, I remember that guy from X-Files. I remember this guy from X-Files. This is like, people get annoyed when I do that, but I love it to death. Hell, I love it so much. One of my birthday gifts was these stupid Mulder and Scully Ken and Barbie dolls, because I just like love the show so much. I've got it on Blu-ray and DVD, the entire series. It's just one of those shows that I think if you're a fan of TV or film or just, you know, production in general, I think you owe it to yourself to watch this show, because just as a part of television history and that legacy that is still continuing to this day, it deserves that respect and that attention and to not be forgotten. And that's one of the things that just kind of does make me sad about it, is because I feel like its legacy has mostly been left as an echo of the past. Things like the Twilight Zone are still living on, but like things that are still being copied from this show to this day. And I feel like maybe it's not getting its dues. I think the show is fantastic. It is phenomenal. It's got some of the best standalone episodes I've ever seen. The mythology is mostly consistent from beginning to end until you get to the revival series that came out 4 years ago, 3 years ago, whatever. It kind of muddied the waters a little bit, but I definitely recommend the initial 9 seasons of the show, the theatrical film. It's a one of a kind, and you should check it out. It's something we haven't quite seen since, and I love it. I love it to death. There's nothing that I can say about it that can really kind of explain how much I love that show and the elements of it. It's just worth it. Check it out. If you have never watched the X-Files, I'll go ahead and say the first 2 seasons-ish, it's all on Hulu right now, so you can watch all 11 seasons of it. You don't have the theatrical film on Hulu, but you can watch everything as far as the television show goes. It's all there. The first couple seasons, because it was in the early 90s, it might feel really dated, But I promise you, once you get into it, once you get into seasons 4 and onward, man, it picks up, it keeps going, and it will hold you onto it. I love these characters, Scully and Mulder. They're one of my favorite characters of fiction of all time, and I just want to keep on sharing that. But anyway, that has been my list. I would love to know your guys' top 10 TV shows of all time. What are your thoughts on any of the shows that I listed? Let's carry on the conversation after the video. This has been taking up too much time at this point, but thank you all so much for tuning in. I can't wait to hear your all's thoughts, and I will catch you guys next time in the next video. Take care, everybody.